I'll be going into more detail on how the music functions. In some of the famous scenes in Psycho, in upcoming videos. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about. Hello, I'm Matthew King, and this is the second video devoted to the score that Bernard Herrmann wrote for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960. This video is going to focus in a little more detail on certain primal aspects of the score, things to do with harmony and orchestration, and to put those things in some kind of context, the broader context of Herrmann's film scores. Another thing perhaps to just flag up at the start is the moral ambiguity of Hitchcock's work. We all know that Alfred Hitchcock was in many ways a morally troubled person, and we know from the testimony of Tippi Hedren that his conduct on set and off set was far from pleasant. In fact, it was abusive.
It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the well, I won't dwell upon it. Come upstairs.
This is not to justify Hitchcock as a person, but many brilliant people are unpleasant people. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that genius is not always the preserve of decent people. And later on in this talk I'll be mentioning Richard Wagner. Famous German composer from the 19th century, who was also morally ambiguous, to say the least. Another example of Hitchcock's ruthless behaviour was the way in which he summarily dismissed Bernard Herrmann, his brilliant composer and, I would say, collaborator. I think Herrmann is partly responsible for the artistic success of the 8 films that he collaborated with Hitchcock on. The story of the dismissal is connected with the final film that they were going to work on, called Torn Curtain, in the 1960s, and Hitchcock had stipulated that he wanted a less romantic score. Herrmann went away and wrote this enormous, terrifying, volcanic prelude to the film, which is absolutely magnificent. When the orchestra played it to Alfred Hitchcock, he turned to Herrmann at the end of the playthrough and said to him, "You're fired."
You're fired.
In front of the orchestra and all the people present. Really bizarre behaviour, and of course they were never reconciled. But the fact remains that despite being an arsehole, Alfred Hitchcock was a brilliant director, there's no question, and the films certainly deserve examination. One of the fascinating things about Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho is the way in which he makes use of almost primal musical components in order to create specific symbolic psychological effects. One of these is actually to do with Herrmann's preference for piling up thirds on top of each other. It's something that he did in Vertigo in 1958, which is 2 films before Psycho. In Vertigo he makes use of E flat minor, so that's 2 thirds on top of each other, and if you extend that by putting another third, a major third on top of the E flat minor triad, you get what we call E flat minor major 7. So it has a major 7th, which creates that tension, a dissonant tension, but it also has the sweetness of the third. So You've got the tension of the discord at either end of the chord, top and bottom, and inside you've got these thirds. The way he uses it in order to symbolise the vertigo, which is in itself a symbol of a world that's kind of turned upside down in that film. The world of the hero, the main protagonist, James Stewart's character. He not only literally has vertigo, he also has a kind of vertigo of the soul because of the way in which his whole world is disorientated. And this is symbolised by two arpeggios, the E flat minor major 7 chord, one going up, the other going down. So the part of the orchestra is going up the arpeggio, the other is coming down. He slightly alters the two patterns because you have a sort of rocking figure at the centre, going from E flat minor 6 to E flat minor 7. That's the effect of the vertigo arpeggio. And sometimes we hear it at double speed, beautifully scored, of course, with harp and flutes and strings in the original score. And then on top of that, you've got the arpeggios floating around. He then adds the killer punch of a vertical combination of the same tones with these brassy, these snarling brass chords, and the tone drop that we originally had within the ostinato pattern going on at the top of each arpeggio. That's now become a motif in its own right, a falling appoggiatura. I should explain what an appoggiatura is. That's a note that leans into a harmony, a dissonant note, which can then resolve away from it. And it's a technique that Bernard Herrmann adapted, I suppose, from his quite considerable knowledge of the scores of Richard Wagner.
It's quite dead, of course.
It's interesting to compare the vertigo chord, the E flat minor major 7 chord in vertigo, with Bernard Herrmann's use of a very similar harmony in the next Hitchcock film that he scored, which was the following year, 1959, the film that actually comes between Vertigo and Psycho, and that's North by Northwest, the great action thriller. Kind of in the middle of that film, there's a terrific sequence that's shot in the United Nations building. It isn't actually in the United Nations building, it's an amazingly elaborate set that was constructed to resemble the United Nations building. But the fascinating thing is that this is a set in which Hitchcock wanted to stage an extremely unsettling murder.
There's been a murder.
All murder is unsettling, but it's unsettling because here we are in the bastion of civilization, in some sense a symbol of solidity and order. And yet this murder takes place right in public view. And so the same chord that he'd used in Vertigo to represent a kind of destabilization, a world turned upside down, is employed for similar effect in North by Northwest, where it's slightly more extreme, in fact. It becomes a combination of G minor. So there's the chord from Vertigo, but if you extend up another third and another third, you get what we call a polychord, a mixture of G minor and F sharp minor. 2 minor chords a semitone apart, but piled up on top of each other. And then the Appogiatura, the leaning note, has just become this little iambic figure, this little short, long rhythmic figure, just to represent something disturbing. He then takes the same chord, that's in the strings, he takes the same chord but turns it round the other way, so you have F sharp minor at the bottom, G minor at the top, and it becomes even more dissonant in the woodwind, a kind of scream, a shrill sound in the woodwind. So strings, woodwind, and then the brass coming in with the third chord, which is a B flat minor major 7 as the third chord. So the three sections of the orchestra are used to symbolise the same sort of horror from 3 vantage points. It's a magnificent piece of scoring.
And look!
He's got a knife! Look out!
Listen to me, I had nothing to do with this.
So then the fascinating thing is to turn forward another year to Psycho in 1960 and see Herrmann using the same approach, the same kind of chord. This time it's B flat minor with an added major 7th, made up again of a sort of succession of thirds going up. And then the chord is inverted in the strings, and you hear, I say it's inverted, but it doesn't have a root. That's the fascinating difference between this and the chords in the previous film. This one has a 5th at the bottom, and so it feels rootless. But it is essentially the same chord. It's that marvellously biting orchestration with the strings, and the rhythm, of course, makes a different effect from the way it was used in Vertigo or in North by Northwest, but it's essentially the same harmony. And the same harmony too for the main theme of the Psycho prelude. This is a theme that you hear several times throughout the film, almost obsessively used by Herrmann, through the night drive scene, the famous night drive scene with the windscreen wipers going backwards and forwards. And in other points in the film, it symbolises the escape, Marion's escape, and her attempt to flee from theft of the money that the film began with. So we have the main theme is made up of actually, if you verticalise that, a motif that's very similar to the motif we were looking at in North by Northwest. And you also get these collisions of thirds, which is very, very similar again to the dissonant chords that we were looking at a minute ago in North by Northwest. Also similar is the use of the strings. In North by Northwest, he has a motif which is used several times in the film to represent fleeing away from the police. This kind of writing, which of course is really quite similar to the use of the frenzied use of quaver patterns in the strings in Psycho. The next contextual thing to say about the score of Psycho is the influence of the music of Richard Wagner.
It's quite dead, of course.
Wagner had been Bernard Herrmann's primary source for his famously lush score for Vertigo. And the great love theme, this melody is, while it isn't specifically Wagnerian, this is a chord that you find all the time in Wagner. It's A flat major with a leaning note, with an Appogiatura hanging over the top, and then resolve into A minor, a chord that's just a semitone up, but with a leaning note, with the B. If I gave you an example from Wagner, Tristan and Isolde, which is an opera that Wagner had written 104 years earlier, in 1854. In that opera, Wagner uses this harmony uninterrupted cadence in F major, but with that Appogiatura over the top. And you notice the similarity with Herrmann's melody. So this use of Appogiaturas, this kind of yearning harmony that Wagner pioneered in Tristan and Isolde, is being carried over in Bernard Herrmann's music for Vertigo. Another famous example, the beginning of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, very famous sound of the cellos and then the chord, what is known as the Tristan chord. A chord that's difficult to explain theoretically.
I'll tell you how it works, right? I took a note, a sawtooth wave, right off this Pantomime 4, put it back here, regened it through itself, looped it back, mixed it with the sound of this crab committing suicide, then let it stew in its own reverb for about 3 hours, right? And then I pump it all out through this shoe to give it that oaky timbre.
Cool. Let's hear it then.
Now go easy, because this is early days.
Okay.
What do you think?
It's neither major or minor, it's actually what we now call a half diminished chord. A diminished chord is that, a half diminished chord is that. Wagner's harmony famously melts without proper resolution into another dissonant harmony, a dominant seventh, and then we have silence. It's an extraordinary effect. The second phrase also fails to resolve and just sidesteps onto a dominant seventh, and then another silence. So you have these yearning chords representing a love that can never be fulfilled except in death.
Dateless bargain to engrossing death.
And this is the material that Herrmann realised would underpin the strange love story of Vertigo.
The weirdest.
Another interesting point of comparison is the music in the love scene in Vertigo. There's a passage where you have on sul ponticello strings playing on the bridge. You hear this chromatic figure, which of course is exactly the same as Wagner's 4 chromatic notes at the beginning of Tristan. But the harmony of Wagner was still with him when he was writing Psycho a couple of years later. As soon as the prelude comes to an end, we have this extraordinary still shot of Phoenix, Arizona, the cityscape from a high position camera. Sequence of descending chords. These are a diminished seventh followed by a series of half diminished sevenths, and it's interesting if you listen. That chord, for example, the second chord in the sequence, what does that remind you of? It's actually the same chord that Wagner used at the beginning of Tristan.
You're right. It's fact.
So these chords, whereas they become symbolic of yearning love in Wagner, in Psycho they're transformed into these strange, floating, ambiguous entities. They float down and then they float back up again. Music without a clear tonal centre. What Herrmann's realised is that Wagner had really created the possibility of a music without a key centre. And that's how this music works. There is no key centre, and therefore we're sort of floating in a kind of lost way. The film therefore begins in a lost state. And we never really find ourselves in Psycho. There's always that sense of being lost, and being lost in a kind of morally ambiguous universe. I think it's true to say that in 1960, when Psycho was released, it had the most dissonant score that any mainstream film had had up to that time. And we've already discussed how Bernard Herrmann used these extraordinary combinations of thirds in order to create dissonant triads. You know, the triad is a symbol of tonality and of order, of musical balance. But of course, if you add triad upon triad, you eventually create these dissonant combinations using major sevenths or ninths. And it's these dissonant intervals that start to dominate in the score. Most famously, notoriously, one might say, the terrifying music for the shower scene. In fact, Hitchcock, as I explained in the previous video, Hitchcock stipulated that he didn't want any music for the shower scene. But Herrmann did it anyway.
Now, why would he do that?
And when Hitchcock saw it, he agreed that it was better with the sound of the stabbing strings. And how many years later, this music is still visceral. It still has an effect upon audiences, and the sound of those high-pitched strings are still part of the public consciousness. You know, children will make the sound of the psycho stabbing string chords when they think of horror films. It's just become a cultural trope, I suppose. And what it consists of is very, very high E flats at the top of the orchestra and the first violins, with the dissonant major seventh of the second violins underneath, playing an E. So you have these sevenths piling downwards. Cellos come in very high. That's another seventh, F to F sharp. So the most dissonant chords you can imagine. Herrmann had been a huge advocate of 20th century music. He was a conductor. He conducted a lot of premieres of new pieces in the United States in the 30s and 40s. He knew the work of Stravinsky extremely well. He knew Arnold Schoenberg's music as well. And he had written a suite for strings in the 1930s, a few passages from which are used again in the music for Psycho. And that suite for strings is an atonal score. And so it's not entirely surprising that this is the moment when he uses the most atonal chord that had been used in mainstream cinema.
I don't think I'll eat just now.
Followed by, and this is often not discussed, but I think is equally striking, the chord, a chord that perhaps to some extent resembles the kind of harmony that Stravinsky had used in The Rite of Spring, but somehow unique, somehow because of the scoring for strings, the downburn of this string chord with the basses coming in, and then the pizzicato on its repetition, so you have this marvellously scored dissonant chord with a very strong bass line moving underneath. I remember when I first watched the movie, the moment when you went to the lower end of the orchestra with these richly harmonized low chords. That was the moment when I remember having a really emotional. That was the emotional impact of the horrid scene. And of course, this is still a scene that shocks and dismays viewers.
Which is, if I may say so, a little more sinister looking, less innocent than the motel itself.
What a lovely weekend. I'll be sure to come back here again.